Some debts aren't paid in money. Some are paid in people. Ivy had known that since she was 17, the night her stepfather came home, reeking of whiskey and loss, sat down at the kitchen table and didn't look at her once while he told her aunt what he'd done. She hadn't run. That was the part she still couldn't explain. Years later, she'd stood in the hallway with her socked feet on the cold linoleum and she'd listened, and something in her chest had gone very quiet. Not calm, not brave, just quiet, like a clock stopping. Her aunt, Renata, had looked at her across the table and said, "You'll go Monday." That was it. No apology. No tears. Renata had raised her out of obligation after her mother died, and obligation had a limit, apparently. $52,000 was the limit. She went Monday. The men who came for her drove a black SUV with tinted windows and didn't speak to her directly. One of them held the door open, not out of courtesy, out of efficiency. She was cargo that walked and carried its own bag. She had packed light, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's watch, a battered composition notebook where she tracked every dollar she'd ever earned, every debt she'd ever been assigned, every number that had ever been used to define her worth. She didn't know why she brought it. Maybe because it was the only record that proved she had existed before this moment. They drove for 3 hours. She watched the city become suburbs, become highway, become nothing much at all. Flat land, industrial sprawl, then a gate that opened without anyone touching it. The house behind the gate wasn't what she'd expected. She hadn't known what she'd expected, exactly. Something gothic, maybe. Something that matched the word monster, which was how her stepfather had described the man he owed money to. "He's not a man you negotiate with," he'd said, the one time she'd tried to ask questions. "He's not a man you cross." But the house was just a house. Large, yes. Clean lines, pale stone, surrounded by old oak trees that had probably been there since before any of this. The money, the gates, the men with earpieces had existed. There were lights on in the upper windows. Someone had left a coffee cup on the front step. It made it worse, somehow. The coffee cup. His name, she learned later, was Harlow. Not a first name, just Harlow. The man who let her in, a compact grey-haired person named Soto, who seemed to serve some ambiguous function between butler and security chief, referred to him only as Mr. Harlow, and only when absolutely necessary. She didn't meet him that first night. She was shown to a room on the 2nd floor, clean, spare, a window that overlooked the back garden, and Soto told her that someone would bring dinner and that she was not to leave the 2nd floor until morning. "Am I a prisoner?" she asked. Soto considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "You are a guest with restricted movement," he said, and left. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her mother's watch. 9:47 p.m. She thought about Renata, who was probably watching television right now. She thought about her stepfather, who was probably feeling relieved. She thought about the $52,000, which was a number she was going to remember for the rest of her life. Then she opened her notebook and started doing math. Not because it was useful, because it was the only thing that made her feel like herself. She met Harlow the next morning, in the kitchen, which was not where she expected to meet him. She'd woken early. She always woke early, a leftovered habit from years of opening the diner at 5:30, and crept downstairs because the alternative was lying in that room, staring at the ceiling until her own thoughts ate her alive. She followed the smell of coffee. He was standing at the counter with his back to her, reading something on a tablet, still in what looked like yesterday's clothes. Dark shirt, dark trousers. He was taller than she'd imagined. Brooder. There was a scar that ran along the left side of his jaw. She noticed it when he turned, unhurried, like he'd known she was there the whole time. He looked at her the way people look at problems they're trying to solve. Not unkindly either. Just analytically. "You're the collateral," he said. She had prepared herself for this. She'd spent half the night preparing for this. "That's one word for it," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration. "Sit down," he said. "Coffee." She sat. She said yes to the coffee. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. "Your stepfather owes me $52,000, Harlow said, sitting down across from her with his own cup. "He has owed me this amount for 14 months. In that time, he has made 3 partial payments totaling $9,000 and has offered me 4 separate repayment plans, none of which he has followed. I know, Ivy said. He looked at her. I did his books, she said. For the restaurant, I saw the withdrawals. I didn't know who they were going to until... She stopped. Until recently. He set down his cup. You did his accounting, informally. I'm good with numbers. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the kind of silence that meant someone was thinking. And you came here, he said finally. Voluntarily, I came here because the alternative was watching Renata lose her house, Ivy said. She's 63 and she has no savings and she didn't ask for any of this either. I came here because I ran the numbers and this was the least bad option. Most people, Harlow said slowly, would have run. Most people aren't good at math. He picked up his coffee again. She couldn't read him. His face was a controlled surface, almost architectural in its evenness, and his eyes gave away very little. What they did give away, she noted, was that he was tired, not sleepy. Tired in a deeper, older way. The way you get tired when you've been doing something difficult for a very long time, and you can't remember why you started. She recognized it because she'd felt it herself. I'll figure out an arrangement, he said. Something that makes sense. You're not a prisoner here. Your man Soto said I was a guest with restricted movement. Soto is precise about language. So am I, she said. The days that followed were strange in a way she didn't have a word for. She had expected cruelty. She had steeled herself for it, packed it into the hard center of herself where she kept all the things she'd survived. Renata's cold silences, her stepfather's casual erasure, the years of being in a house where she was tolerated, not wanted, where she took up space that would have been better used for someone else, and everyone knew it, and no one said it, which was somehow worse than if they had. She had expected Harlow to be a version of all that, amplified. A man who owned people, a man who dealt in debts. Instead, she found someone who knocked before entering any room she was in, who left books outside her door, not as a gesture, she realized, but because Soto had apparently told him she'd exhausted the second-floor shelf and he was solving a problem, who ate breakfast at 6:15 every morning and dinner at 7 in the evening and existed, in between, in a state of controlled, purposeful motion that she found oddly settling. She began to understand the house. She began to understand its rhythms. And she began to understand, slowly, that it was a house that ran on numbers, on ledgers and logistics and supply chains and payments, and that something in it was not running right. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, through small inconsistencies. A recurring line item in a sheet Soto left on the counter that didn't match its corresponding entry. A 2% discrepancy that would have been invisible if you weren't looking, if you didn't have the particular kind of brain that itched at the sight of a column that didn't sum cleanly. She didn't say anything. She wrote it in her notebook, then she found another one, then a third. She knocked on the door of Harlow's office on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks in. He opened it himself. He was on the phone. He held up one finger, the universal signal, and she waited in the doorway while he finished a conversation she couldn't follow, conducted in a tone that suggested the person on the other end was in some degree of trouble. When he hung up, he looked at her. Something wrong? Depends, she said, on whether you want me to tell you about it. He stepped back to let her in. The office was exactly what she expected of him. Sparse, organized, a wide desk with 3 monitors, a whiteboard on one wall covered in diagrams she didn't try to interpret. One window, facing west. A single photograph on the desk, face down. She put her notebook on the desk between them, opened to the page where she'd been tracking the discrepancies, and waited while he read. The silence stretched. "Where did you find this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not angry, something more controlled than angry. "Soto leaves a summary sheet in the kitchen sometimes. I'm good at reading things quickly." She paused. "I wasn't trying to. I wasn't spying. I just see numbers. I know you weren't spying." He was still looking at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "This has been going on for how long?" he asked. "Based on what I can see from the fragments I've caught. Probably 8 months. Maybe longer." She hesitated. "Someone is skimming very carefully. Small amounts, different channels, enough variation that it doesn't pattern match if you're only looking at one line at a time. But if you look across, she turned to the next page, where she'd mapped it out. It adds up. Harlow was quiet for a long time. "You laid this out from kitchen summaries," he said, "and one sheet I saw on the table in the hall, and what I remembered from the books at the restaurant, which cross-referenced with 2 of these vendor names." She looked at him. "I have a good memory for numbers." Apparently, she waited for him to say something else. He didn't. He was looking at her in that way again, the problem-solving look, but different now, recalibrated again, and she couldn't tell exactly what the recalibration meant. "I'll have Soto bring you the full ledgers," he said finally. She blinked. "What?" "If you can find this from scraps," he said. "I want to know what you find in the actual records. She stopped. "I'm the collateral. You're someone who just found a leak I've had 3 accountants miss for 8 months, Harlow said. "I'm adjusting my position." She found it in 11 days. Not just the leak, the source. A man named Prescott, who ran logistics for the Eastern distribution, who had been moving small percentages off the top for nearly a year, routing it through a shell vendor in Delaware that had been set up 9 months prior. He'd been careful. He'd been smart. He just hadn't accounted for the possibility that someone would look at all of it simultaneously, without the blinders that came from being too close to any one part. She presented it to Harlow on a Thursday evening, across the kitchen table, because that was where they'd fallen into the habit of talking. Not the office, not any of the formal rooms, just the kitchen, which was warm and smelled like coffee, and had a table that was good for spreading papers on. He went through everything she'd laid out. He asked 3 questions. She answered all of them. Then he looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the controlled surface of his face shifted into something that wasn't calculated. Something that was simply, directly, honest. "You didn't have to bring this to me," he said. "I know. You could have sat on it. Used it." "I thought about it," she said, because she had. She'd spent a night turning it over, what she could do with the information, what leverage it might give her, how she could use it to negotiate her own exit. "But I don't actually want leverage. I want the debt cleared and I want to go home. There's nothing to go home to." It landed harder than she expected because it was true. Renata's house, which was not a home, her stepfather, who was not a father. A job at a diner that paid $12 an hour plus tips on good days. "Maybe not," she said. "But that's my problem." He was quiet for a long moment. "The debt," he said. She looked at him. "What you found, what you saved me, is worth more than what your stepfather owes. Significantly more." He folded his hands on the table. "We're square. You can leave tomorrow if you want." She should have felt relief. She waited for it. It didn't come the way she expected. It came mixed with something else, something tangled and inconvenient, and she didn't look at it too closely because she already knew she wasn't going to like what she found. "Okay," she said. "Unless," Harlow said, "you don't." She looked at him. "I need someone who sees numbers the way you do," he said. "Not an accountant, not another analyst. Someone who looks at the whole thing at once and finds the thing that shouldn't be there." He said it the same way he said everything. Level, direct, no performance. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the debt. The debt is gone. I'm asking because you're good at something I need. You're asking me to work for you?" "Yes." "For the organization?" "Yes." She looked down at her notebook. The pages of numbers that had saved her, that had always saved her. The only language she'd ever been fluent in, the one that never lied, that always, eventually, told the truth. "What does it pay?" she asked. Something that was almost. A smile moved across Harlow's face. "More than $12 an hour," he said. She stayed. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was the math. Better opportunity, better security, a chance to save money and actually build something instead of just surviving. She told herself these things for about 2 months, and they were true, all of them, and they were also not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, and she wasn't ready to look at it yet. What she could look at, the work, which was real and difficult, and used parts of her brain she hadn't used in years. Harlow gave her access to everything. Full ledgers, shipping manifests, payroll, the intricate and deliberately opaque financial architecture of an operation that moved more money in a month than she'd seen in her entire life. He didn't explain what most of it was. She didn't ask. She learned the shape of it the way she'd learned the shape of everything, from the inside, from the numbers, from the places where things didn't add up. She found 2 more problems in the first month. He handled them. She didn't ask how. She found a structural inefficiency in the 3rd month. Not theft, just bad design. A routing system that was costing more than it needed to, because no one had looked at the whole picture, and laid out a solution on 3 pages of her notebook. Harlow read it, asked 2 questions, and implemented it within the week. "You should be getting paid more than we agreed," he said, the evening after. "We haven't been keeping track," she said. He looked at her with something that was becoming slowly a recognizable expression, the one that meant she'd said something that surprised him, which happened less and less often, but still happened. "You're not tracking it?" "I'm tracking it," she said. "I just haven't said anything yet." I was waiting. For what, she considered? For it to feel like the right time. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then is it the right time?" "I think so," she said. They renegotiated. She was fair. He matched her figure and added 10%, which she took as a statement of something neither of them was saying yet. She learned him in pieces. The photograph on his desk as she eventually saw a woman, older, his mother, she thought, from the jaw. The way he went still and focused when something required precision and loose and easy when it didn't. Like a machine that had 2 speeds and knew exactly which one to use. The way he was hardest to read at the moments when he was paying the most attention. He learned her too. She caught him doing it. The small adjustments, the tiny recalibrations. The way he started leaving her coffee already made when he knew she'd be in early. The way he framed questions for her now, having figured out that she answered better when she wasn't given too much context first, that she liked to find her own way to the answer. She knew she was in trouble when she started looking forward to the kitchen table. She knew she was in serious trouble when she noticed he did too. It was Renata who broke it open, not intentionally. She called 3 months in, the first time she'd called since Ivy had left. Her voice was small and strange, stripped of its usual cool efficiency, which had always been its defining texture. "Your stepfather," Renata said, "has gotten himself into something worse." Ivy felt the cold spread from her chest outward. The new debt was not to Harlow. It was to a man named Voss, a name Ivy had seen in passing in some of the ledgers, a rival. Someone Harlow's organization had a history with, a history that lived in the terse, careful language of certain documents she'd learned not to ask about. Her stepfather, gambling again, chasing losses, had borrowed from the wrong person. This time he'd offered Renata's house. Ivy sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after she hung up. She thought about the math. She thought about what she had and what she didn't have, and what options existed and what they cost. Then she went and found Harlow. She told him all of it, straight through, no editorializing, just the facts, clean and clear, the debt, the creditor, the asset at risk, the timeline. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this because you think I can do something about it," he said. "I'm telling you this because I don't have another option and I know you have history with Voss, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know that." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking as the collateral, I'm asking as your—" She stopped, because she didn't have a word for what she was. Employee didn't cover it. Neither did anything else she could safely say. "I'm asking as someone who has been honest with you since the day I walked in here." "You have," he said. "I know what I'm asking for costs something. I know it's not simple." She held his gaze. "Name a price." "I'm not going to name a price," he said quietly. "Then what are you going to do?" He stood up. "Handle it." She didn't ask what that meant. She'd learned by now that when Harlow said he would handle something, it got handled in ways she was better off not needing to know about. Voss's claim on Renata's house was dissolved within a week. Ivy didn't know how. She didn't ask. What she knew was that the morning it was resolved, Harlow came to the kitchen at 6:15, poured 2 cups of coffee, and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Just direct." "Why not?" "Because I didn't do it as a transaction," he said. "And I don't want you to treat it like one." She looked at him across the table. This man with the scarred jaw and the tired eyes and the two speeds and the photograph face down on his desk, who had knocked on every door before entering, who had matched her figure and added 10%, who had left coffee already made when she'd be in early. She thought about the debt that had brought her here. She thought about the notebook full of numbers that had built something neither of them had meant to build. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. And that was, somehow, the most honest thing either of them had said. Her stepfather, when she finally spoke to him again, expected gratitude. Expected her to be grateful that things had been sorted, that Renata was safe, that everything had smoothed over. The way everything always smoothed over for him, because he'd spent a lifetime being bailed out and had mistaken that for luck, rather than what it actually was. The labor of people around him who cared more about consequences than he did. She met him for coffee once, at a diner on a Tuesday morning. She sat across from him in a plastic booth and watched him explain himself. The bad streak, the bad timing, the circumstances that had conspired against him, the ways in which none of it was quite his fault. She listened to the whole thing. Then she slid a piece of paper across the table. He picked it up. It was a number. "What is this?" he asked. "What you've cost," she said, added up. From the beginning. The number was not just $52,000. It was 17 years of cost, small and large, direct and indirect. It was every diner shift she'd worked to cover what he didn't. Every number she'd tracked in a composition notebook because no one else was paying attention. Every moment she'd spent being careful so that someone else could afford to be careless. She'd done the math carefully. She'd double-checked it twice. He looked at the number for a long time. "Ivy," he started. "I'm not asking you to pay it," she said. "I'm just making sure you know it exists." She left him there with the paper and the coffee, and she walked out into the morning, which was cool and bright and smelled like rain coming. She went back, not because she had to, not because the debt, the original formal transactional debt, had any remaining claim on her. She went back because she'd done the math on that too, and the math said that the thing she had at that kitchen table, with the coffee and the papers and the man who recalibrated every time she surprised him, was worth more than anything she was going back to. Harlow was in the kitchen when she arrived. He looked up when she came in. He didn't ask where she'd been. He'd learned by now that she'd tell him when she was ready. She sat down, she put her notebook on the table. "I want to renegotiate again," she said. He looked at her, and that almost smile crossed his face again, the one she'd catalogued by now in the same careful way she catalogued everything. "What terms?" he asked. "Better ones," she said, "across the board." He was quiet for a moment, then defined the board. She met his eyes. "All of it," she said. The silence between them held something new. Not the controlled silence of two people being careful, but the wide-open silence of two people who had already stopped pretending. He reached across the table and turned a page in her notebook to a blank one. "Start writing," he said. She picked up the pen. For the first time in as long as she could remember, the numbers she was working with were entirely her own.